Chapter 10, More Tales, Rothery Road and Beyond. 1959, the Kettle's Big Day Out. It was a Saturday and it was winter. Dad got an urgent call from his brother in Port Kembla to help with some boot-making equipment. As was his habit, he would boil some water in the kettle to put through the radiator of the old Chev, to help it turn over after a cold night. Mum always kept an old kettle on the fuel stove for a constant supply of hot water for tea and cleaning and the like. Dad took the kettle out to the car, poured a measure of hot water into the radiator and then started the car. With the engine idling in a steady fashion, he went back inside. A few minutes later he headed back to the car, when Mum came out with a list of items for him to pick up at the shops. Being in a hurry, Dad took the list, closed the bonnet and drove off. Sometime later Mum went to get the kettle. But it was nowhere to be seen. So she asked us kids if we had seen it. None of us had. So she did another round of the house, but to no avail. I was out in the backyard collecting coal for the fuel stove, when Dad drove back in the driveway. I turned round to see the car pull up, complete with the kettle swinging back and forth on the bumper bar. I collapsed with shrieks of laughter. Next door Mrs. Musgrove, on hearing the commotion, came out to see what was going on. At the same time Mum, Colleen, and Francis came out the back door. We all broke up. Dad looked somewhat perplexed. Until he walked round to the front of the car. Then he too broke out in raucous laughter. In his haste he had hooked the kettle over one of the overriders on the bumper, probably in case the radiator needed a top-up. He had driven over an hour and a half, through Port Kembla and Wollongong, with a half-full kettle swinging freely on the front of the car. 1960, keeping it clean. It was a weekend at the height of summer, when all of us wanted to be someplace else. Anywhere else. The heat and humidity made us all uncomfortable and a little unbearable. With us all hanging out for the afternoon sea breeze, Mum decided to call it a day, chores-wise. One last thing to do, and she looked around for one last person to do it. Clean the outhouse. Mark, who had been keeping quiet in his bedroom, made the mistake of heading out to the backyard. "Mark," said Mum, "be a good boy and give the toilet a clean and a washout. When you get a moment. It's been a hot day, so it will need it." With that she went back to what she was doing. If there was one chore you wanted to avoid on a stifling hot day, it was cleaning the dunny. The only thing worse was using it. Mark sighed. And set off down the back path, with a let's get it over and done with attitude. So he collected a bucket and the antiseptic. Mixed the solution with a little water from the tap at the end of the path. Opened the door to the outhouse and sluiced the liquid over the floor. He left the antiseptic beside the toilet, and taking the bucket trudged back down the path to the tap for the water to rinse the outhouse out. A good half-minute's walk. Having filled the bucket as much as he could manage, he trudged back up the path. Using his foot to push the door open, he heaved the water in. It was hard to know just who got the bigger shock. Mum, who had got an urgent call from nature, or Mark. Both screamed and took off. In very different directions. As you can imagine, the story did the rounds for quite a few days after. 1961, back at you. The Ryan family had some pretty strong edicts, which we, the new bearers of the name, were schooled and at times scolded into accepting. We were raised to despise racism, segregation, and most particularly, the harsh or condescending judgment of others. No matter what the circumstances. Both my parents were long on life's lessons. One in particular I will never forget. It was one of my father's, and it taught me as much about life as it did about the man himself. I was about 11 and well versed in the age-old pastime of my peers, that of giving cheek. So one day I sought to prove myself by casting aspersions on a local neighborhood vagrant. To me the man, even from a distance, was just a smelly, unkempt drunk. But suddenly my father emerged from the house and abruptly brought me up short. "That man you are calling a dirty old hobo was an Australian soldier in the Second World War," he said directly. One of his jobs, he continued, looking directly into my eyes, was to clear the decaying bodies from the battlefield after the fight was over. He went on, "That is an experience too horrible for you or I to imagine." When he came home, he couldn't face people anymore, and so he just gave up on living. All he's got now is the drink, and that's why he's become what he is. To his eternal credit as a parent, and not for the first time, my dad then set about proving he was more than a man of his word. Dad saw no value in lectures if they lacked a practical and positive outcome. He wanted his children to carry more than words around in their heads. So he said to me, "Phil, point your finger at that man." So I did. "Now, son, look down at your other 3 fingers, the ones under the finger that's doing the pointing. See, those other 3 fingers are pointing back at you." And there it was. My father's never to be forgotten words to the wise. Never stand in judgment of others, because when you do, remember you really judging yourself 3 times over. Those 3 fingers are there to remind you of that. It was some years before I realized that what my father was passing on was exactly what Jesus taught. Don't talk about the speck in someone else's eye until you take the log out of your own. But that day, my father also taught me something else. He gave me a first-hand practical application of unconditional love, simple enough for a young boy to remember. "Now, son," he said, "here's the 2 shillings I will be giving you for your pocket money." He placed the coin in my hand. "Now go over and give it to this poor man, and here's another 3 shillings from me. After all, it is the season of Lent, so let's you and I make the sacrifice. When you offer it to him, say, 'Here's 5 bob for you from my father and me. Have a happy day.'" And I did. When I returned, my father told me more of the man's war experience. And as I stood and listened, I saw my father in a new and different light. It was as if he had opened a new door of understanding. He was saying, "Don't judge a book until you've read it. Or until you have at least turned over some of the pages. In the cool of the evening. Abiding memories." A span of summers that now seemed to stretch from the late 50s to the early 60s. The women of Rothery Road that my mother knew would gather under the streetlight across from our house. They would gather in the cool of the evening, around mealtimes. Sometimes before, sometimes later. There they would chat, catch up, share and exchange hand-me-downs and the news of the day. It was their downtime. But it was also our time. For out of those gatherings came the news of our neighbors, of our community, the news of the world outside number 77. Mum and Del Burchell would lead the way. Mum to Del's house, and from there they would cross the street and wait for the others to join them. As far as I could tell, no phone calls were made or messages sent. The women of our immediate neighborhood would just congregate for half an hour or so. From our front porch I could see them standing, talking, laughing, sometimes exchanging clothing or the like. The men and we kids never intervened or joined them. It was an understanding we all shared. Their gathering spoke more than anyone could say. It was the ritual, the sign that the day was drawing to a close, that all was right with the world. Well, the world of Rothery Road at least. But it was something else too. A reassurance that everything was in hand, and in the best of hands at that. Tom Roberts, Arthur Streeton, even the American Norman Rockwell could not have captured the moment of that small gathering with greater meaning. Simple and timeless. At a time when people still had time. Where gardens grow. The house at Rothery Road was now home, for me and most of my siblings. Joy had moved back to Wollongong during the week, living at the hospital's nurses' quarters. Bill, now a teacher, resided in the small hamlet of Herald's Cross near Braidwood. Where we had a patch of grass under the clothesline in Crown Street, we suddenly became owners of 2 yards, front and back, that needed to be turned into lawn. The backyard particularly, would take Dad and my older brothers some time and 2 mowers to achieve this. Uneven as it was something I would in my high school years inherit the responsibility for. Although I would first have to prove myself raking up the grass clippings, before Dad would let me loose with the 2-stroke. Home is where the heart is, and the 2 yards soon became a reflection of that. Both Mum and Dad loved the space and grounds that came with the new home. At some point Dad planted a mulberry tree in the backyard. It provided the yard with shade and the family with fruit. He also planted a veggie patch, something Mum made good use of in the winter months. Dad also purchased chickens from the weekend markets at the Wollongong showground. He then built them a yard with shade from next door's coral tree. The hens got the benefits of the shade and Dad, a steady supply of eggs. I can't remember what name it went by. The coop, the run, the yard, the pen? Whatever its name, it's where all the recycling of number 77 took place. Grass clippings, weeds, vegetable peelings, ash from the stove and the fireplace. It all ended up there for the hens to process. And process they did. After all, what goes around? Another job I would later inherit. The garden became the place I most enjoyed in my high school years. It was my patch. A place where I could let my enthusiasm take root. A place where I could reflect and come to terms with my changes and challenges. Whatever it was part of my DNA. A seed from Uncle Holly's farm? Who can say? Putting down roots. Either way, working beside Mum, planting the annuals in the garden beds created by Dad, was where I first discovered my passion for gardening. As in the words of the old song, get a little dirt on your hands. I just loved it. So it was not all that surprising a year or two later when I began attending St. Paul's College at Bellambi, that I came across something of a small revelation. I had to pass the Bellambi Bowling Club on my way to and from school. Often, I would see a neighbor of ours, tending the bowling greens. Some days watering, some days mowing or rolling the turf. He was the apprentice groundsman at the club. A seed was definitely planted. Could this be the line of work for me? With a stroke of serendipity, the head groundsman at the club, Ted, would later be my tutor at Wollongong TAFE, in groundkeeping, as part of my horticultural studies. All this just a stone's throw from Rothery Road. The working life, in the 1950s and 60s. The workplace of course was mainly male, though not always. Professions, with the exception of the oldest one, were almost entirely male. There were of course women who did work. But always in establishments that were deemed suitable. Suitable meaning, an extension of the woman's role in the home. An example would be working in women's apparel at Myers or a telephonist with the PMG. A woman's place was in the home, provided she had one. And if she did, it was unlikely she owned it. A woman was not permitted to get a mortgage, unless it was signed and guaranteed by their husband. Or in some of the better suburbs, her father. Either way, while a woman could certainly live in a house, she couldn't own it. Not until the owner died at any rate. All women, however, were working women. Whether they had a job or not. And if they did, they would only be earning 2/3 of the male basic wage anyway. But male or female, young or old, blue collar or white, we all took our lunch to work. Quite a saving as I recall. When it came to commuting, we mostly took the bus, the train, or a tram. Or in some more salubrious situations, a ferry. If you drove to work, then you were a tradie or a taxi driver, delivery driver, or some such. There were exceptions of course, but as they were unlikely to stop and give you a lift, they are not mentioned here. Clocking off. In 1950s Australia, for those of you who missed it, there was men's work and there was women's work. They also had separate watering holes. The thinking being, that a husband and wife should never see each other drunk and unaccompanied in public. Also, the buying of a round of drinks at the bar was considered preferable to getting the rounds of the kitchen at home. Consequently, women never drank in the front bar at a pub. They entered by a side door to what was called the ladies' lounge. And with a 6 o'clock swill in progress, the front bar was a place best avoided, as Medicare was still a long way off. Sport of course was the bastion of all things male. Until the women started winning medals in the Olympics and Commonwealth Games. Then even the tabloids got into the act. But it still was essentially a male thing. It was about cricket, tennis, golf, and bowls, hockey, athletics and swimming and very soon surfing. The holy grail was of course football, even the round ball code. Winter was where it was at. City or country, in every state, at grounds all over the country, males gathered to play or watch the teams go round. Women too were there to watch. After all, community is what it was all about. The only other place where the sexes got together to watch a sport was at the races. The women and the men got dressed up and had a flutter and a beer or shandy or two. And maybe a bite to eat on the way home. If you wanted to see the whole picture of Australian society in those days, you went to the racetrack. I guess some things just don't change.